Innsmouth, stranger.
Greetings, friends, and please do make your way into the library here. As you can see, we're taking a break from our usual schedule today to mark some quite sad news. I'm one of your guides, Rob Poynton.
And I'm the other one, Tim Mendes. Yes, we are gathering here today to mark the sad passing of Mr. Brian Lumley, who a very, very well-respected author of the Cthulhu mythos, amongst other things.
Yeah, I think when you look back on Lumley's output, it's quite incredible, really. It's one of those things you sort of take for granted a bit, you know, but when I think of the amount of Lumley books I've got and I've read, and then I look back at the ones also that I haven't read as well, it's quite an amazing body of work, isn't it?
Indeed, yeah. There was a whole, like, Necroscope aside, there was several distinct series as well. Like, you had his Titus Crow stories, which we'll be looking at in greater detail in a bit. You had his Primal Lands, which was his sword and sorcery, Cthulhu mythos-y stuff. And you also had his Dreamlands novels as well, like Ship of Dreams and things like that.
Yeah. And in that sense, it reminded me a little bit of Clark Ashton Smith's approach, you know, each of these different settings, which were distinct and separate, and yet were tied together in various tentacular ways.
Yeah. It's funny you said about the about how many paperbacks and things like that you've got, because the first thing I did when I heard about his passing was went and dug them all out. It was like, I mean, I've got a lot of Brian Lumley. So I've been a fan of his work since I was a teenager, really. So,
well, shall we start with that again? Let's start with maybe our personal perspectives and when we first discovered Lumley.
Yeah, I discovered him around the same sort of time that I discovered Ramsey Campbell. I think it was actually through the Tales of the Cthulhu mythos, the paperback. I can't remember who republished it here in the UK, but his story in that, which is Cement Surroundings, I think, was his story in that. And and then I as I've mentioned before, I spent a lot of time lurking around secondhand bookshops and the market in Macclesfield. There was always a guy with boxes full of paperbacks, right, every Saturday morning. So I used to just go and rummage through them. And I found one of his amongst that. And again, I can't remember for the life of me which one it was now. But yeah, I was kind of hooked from there. So it was around the same sort of time that I was reading Cold Print from Ramsey Campbell. It was sort of around that same sort of time.
I think it was similar for me, and I'm guessing it was particularly when I started playing Call of Cthulhu. So I guess we're looking sort of early 80s, 82, something like that. And I started expanding my mythos reading. So obviously Ramsey Campbell, and then Brian Lumley was the other big one. And particularly getting into things like when we started playing the Dreamlands campaign. You mentioned the Dreamlands set in Hero of Dreams and that kind of stuff, which I liked because it was sort of mythos with a little bit of a sword and sorcery twist. You know, it was slightly more Howardian than Lovecraftian in that sense.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing plugged directly into our gaming as well. I found with Lumley's work, it was a very easy transfer into gaming and getting scenario ideas and that sort of stuff. So it's hugely enjoyable.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the sort of Howardian, because there's a hell of a lot of that in his Primal Lands stuff, because that's all proper. It's basically sort of Conan-orific, isn't it? It's.
I think you've just invented a new word.
I know, but again, it's quite distinctly different. And I think where that a lot of the difference comes in is that Lumley actually took more of a Derlethian approach than a Lovecraft.
Yeah.
In terms of, he used the elemental idea quite a lot. It's like, I've got actually fairly recently released. It's an anthology of 4 novellas called Earth, Air, Wind and Fire. So each novella has an element. So obviously Cthulhu is fire,
right?
You know, yeah. Shubby is that kind of thing, which was the sort of Derleth approach, wasn't it?
Yeah, and this is something he took some stick for, right? Which we're going to reference later on. I will just mention at this stage as well, that particular part, I went through my old Dagon fanzines because they used to cover Lumley a lot. Now, Dagon, for those who don't know, was a British fanzine that came out sort of early 80s. I think it started mid 80s.
Yeah.
I think this issue is actually 1986. And it was put out by a chap called Carl T. Ford, also sadly no longer with us. And it was a sort of mixture of RPG, looking at the various mythos tomes, interviews with authors. I don't remember they had a Thomas Ligotti special, that kind of thing. So a really excellent fanzine. And I remembered in one of them there was a interview with Brian Lumley. So we're going to be drawing on that a little bit today as well, because I always think it's nice when you hear the author explain things in their own words. It takes away any speculation then, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And it was funny because we had basically the same idea, because I remembered, because I've got 3 collections in front of me here, 2 of which are from Solaris, and one of which is Hagopian and Other Stories, a Cthulhu mythos collection, which is his short stories, and The Taint and Other Novellas, which is a companion piece to it, again, a Cthulhu mythos collection. And I've also got the Complete Crow.
Yeah.
But all of 3 of these have got notes on each story by Brian Lumley. And they've also got introductions written by Brian Lumley. Right. And the introductions in the Solaris ones have got some really, really interesting pieces about how he got into the mythos and the sort of influence on Derleth and Arkham House on his career and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to be drawing on that.
And do you think it's something perhaps we respond to his work well because he's an English author? Do you think that's part of it? I mean, in a way that Ramsey Campbell obviously draws on his surroundings and his upbringing, and that atmosphere, it really comes across as authentic, and you can taste it, you can touch it. Do you get the same sense with Lumley in a lot of this? Because most of his work is set in Britain. Well, there are some in the Mediterranean, I know, but it's very British, isn't it?
It is, because obviously he was in the army as well, wasn't he? So he did travel quite a lot. He was stationed out in Germany, wasn't he? And things like that. But yeah, I think it is. It's especially, like, I know a story you covered way back at the beginning of the Innsmouth Book Club. You covered Dagon's Bell. I think it was like the first ever one you did, wasn't it, or something?
I think it was. Yeah, isn't that strange? Yeah, it was the Dagon's Bell. Yeah, which is set up in the northeast, right? I think.
Indeed, but the atmosphere in that, because I've been exactly where that is set, and like the mist rolling in and all the rest of it. That he calls it a miasma, doesn't he? And all this, and yeah, he's very evocative of British seaside. And in a way that, like you say, Ramsey Campbell's is to me, because I grew up not far from there, from where a lot of his stuff is set. So I can see the trees, I can hear the river, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah.
So Brian Lumley was born in 1937 in County Durham, as we said, up in the northeast. He was born just 9 months after Lovecraft died, which kind of ties the 2 generations together in I'd say a nice way. It's not the term, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, interesting you mentioned that, because he actually mentions that in the introduction in The Taint. He says, another connection I failed to make with Lovecraft, which was pointed out to me by Donald A. Wolfheim of DAW Books fame, was that I was born on the 2nd of December 1937, just 9 months after Lovecraft's death. Wolfheim found the chronology or synchronicity interesting. I found it entirely coincidental.
And of course, in that era, as a kid, he was reading things like Dan Dare and really got into science fiction. But in his teens, he discovered a story by Robert Bloch. And then we'll go into this in a little more detail in a minute, I'm sure. He joined the military. He served in the military police. In fact, he served for 22 years, I think it was. And he was stationed out in Germany. And that's where he got his first introduction to HPL, I believe.
Yeah, we did a book entitled Cry Horror, which was the British title of a volume originally published by Arkham House in the US.
Which I have a copy of in my hand.
Nice.
This book is kept in a protective wrapper. I paid 40 pence for it, according to the biro on the inside front cover.
Blimey.
This is the WDL edition, published in 1959. How about that?
Nice. So that's the very same book that where he discovered it. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, there's an interesting beat here also in the taint about how he discovered it. You said about Robert Bloch. Myself, I came across the mythos when I was just 13 or 14 in a story by Robert Bloch of Psycho fame. The short story was entitled Notebook Found in a Deserted House. And from then on, for the next 7 or 8 years, I would keep stumbling across various hints in the weird fiction I was reading that suggested an interconnected thread or threads, a very intricate literary theme, like a web woven from oddly similar stories by a handful of disparate authors. This was, of course, the very fabric or skein of the Cthulhu mythos, though at that time I failed to make a solid connection.
And it was a little bit after that, it was in Cyprus in 1963 that he discovered August Derleth.
Mm-hmm.
The copy of the paperback Dark Mind, Dark Heart. And from that, he discovered August Derleth's address at Arkham House. I presume that was an Arkham House book, Dark Mind, Dark Heart. A few years went by, and Lumley says, I scribbled a few short stories for my eyes only, but as more bits of Lovecraft came to light, I started to build a collection, and finally I wrote to Arkham House for books. And when he did that, he also enclosed some of his own work, which he puts in inverted commas, because, you know, these would have been his very first stories. And Derleth replied.
Nice. Yeah, he says similar in here. He says, along with monies, I sent some extracts, in inverted commas, from a handful of dubiously titled black books, the survivors of antique, now extinct civilizations that either worshipped or shunned the variously imagined gods and demons of the Cthulhu cycle. So, yeah.
And not only did Derleth respond, right, he commented on Lumley's work and actually invited him to have a bash at writing something for what was going to become the Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos collection.
Mm.
So again, we're struck by this cycle repeating itself of this group of authors in this particular very sort of niche. It's niche, isn't it? But how encouraging they all are of each other.
Oh, yeah.
Because Derleth could have just sent the books back and said, oh, there's your books. But you can see there's a young new writer and he's going to help the guy out. So we go straight back to that supportive nature of the Lovecraft circle again.
Yeah, it's a distinct parallel to, it's almost exactly the same, in fact, of what happened with Ramsey Campbell.
Yes.
Campbell sent, it was written in an exercise book, wasn't it? A collection of stories he'd written in a school exercise book, sent it to Derleth. And it was the same thing. I think there was quite a gap, wasn't there, with Lumley, of things getting printed. I think it took a while,
right.
As he sort of honed what he was doing. But you do get this impression of Derleth as being a kind of mentor, and you get that in this other introduction here, that Lumley's very protective over Derleth. That's how he comes across in this. So just a little extract here. He's been talking about Derleth and Arkham House and all that kind of stuff, and preserving Lovecraft and all this. So then surely we should thank August Derleth for all of this, especially for the preservation of Lovecraft's works, including 5 vast volumes of his letters, but in particular for turning Arkham's spotlight on the Cthulhu mythos. We should, but has he in fact received such thanks? No, not really. Instead, Derleth has been much criticised in certain quarters with regard to his treatment of the mythos, which is to say that mainly in a somewhat cursory definition of the mythos, he grafted onto it elements of a religious background that parallel the Christian mythology and appear not to sit well with HPL's original intentions. This and certain other minor crimes perpetrated in his editorial capacity during a short lifetime of publishing, amongst others, a long list of otherwise neglected authors, have seen Derleth castigated for being, of all things, a heretic. This, paradoxically, by the self-same people who insist upon Lovecraft's destitute mythos ideology. Indeed, it has sometimes seemed to me that the most fanatical of HPL's readers have made a god, or at least fashioned an idol, out of Lovecraft himself.
Interesting.
So yeah,
interesting.
It is very interesting. Yeah.
And we know we've spoken about this a number of times, that, yeah, there is that, what some people might coin the Derlethian mythos, and you mentioned the elements and all those other aspects. And even, well, that was interesting, wasn't it? Because Derleth got castigated for the family tree approach.
Yes,
But then, what do we find in the letters between Smith and Lovecraft? We find a family tree or two.
indeed. Well, Smith wrote it, didn't he? Because it's in one of the, I think it's the Necronomicon Chaosium collection. It was a letter.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. And again, I think something that people can lose sight of is Lovecraft and Smith, etc., were having fun with this stuff.
Yeah.
We know what their personal beliefs were, or certainly to a large extent. But this was an exercise in creating something. It became a bit of kind of an in-joke, perhaps, amongst a group of friends and writers.
Yeah.
And they'd take little bits of each other's stories and kill each other off in the stories and all this kind of thing.
Love that playful aspect to it. Yeah.
So this was never meant to be this hard defined, very straight-edged mythology as we see in some other famous fantasy works.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
This was always a loose conglomeration of ideas, and really I think the aim of it was to help spur creativity as much as anything. Absolutely.
And that's pretty much where what Brian Lumley is saying here. I just want one short paragraph here before I end on this bit. He says, myself, I believe that where H.P. Lovecraft is concerned, August Derleth's efforts were heroic. Because of him, the mythos lives on, and also because of him, again, on a personal level, I am what I have since become, a moderately successful author of this, the book you now hold in your hands, and of many other books, all of which to explain why, and not for the first time, I have dedicated this volume, to the memory of August Derleth. So there you go.
There you go.
Yeah.
So Lumley did receive some of these criticisms himself, as we mentioned, which we'll talk about in a moment. But let's take a fairly brief overview of his work, because there's so much of it. We're going to cover one of the short stories today. Obviously, we've not had much time to prepare for this episode, so we've chosen one of the shorter Titus Crow stories. But I'm sure in the future we'll come back and perhaps we'll look at some of the novellas or collections. So the story that went in for the Tales of the Cthulhu mythos was Cement Surroundings, which you mentioned before. That's our very early mythos story for Lumley, and one that introduces his own mythos tome, the Cathat Aquadingen, which we'll be coming back to later on as well.
Indeed. It also introduces his own mythos beastie as well, doesn't it? Shudem El, or yes, however the hell you pronounce it. A creature which I've used in a couple of stories.
So straight away we see that again. This isn't just taking what Lovecraft wrote, it's putting your own additions into it. And then as a reader, you have the choice whether you want to accept that or not, really. I never had any major issue with that approach.
No, it's similar to what Campbell did with Britchester and Glarkey, isn't it? It's a similar thing.
Yeah. It's almost a tradition to do in this field, I think, didn't you?
Oh, yeah. First thing I did was created my own mythos beastie, Jerigathy. Yeah. First thing I did.
So we've mentioned these various facets or settings for Lumley's work. Probably the series he became most well known for in the mainstream is the Necroscope series, which was going to start off as a trilogy, but I think ended up with at least 5 or 6 or 7 or maybe even more. I think there was a Vampire World trilogy in the 90s as well.
Yeah, there was spin-offs of the spin-offs of the spin-offs, I think, from what I remember.
Yeah, and there were graphic novels. There was an RPG based around it, figures. There were audiobook spin-offs. And on its release in 1984, the first volume got up to almost 2 million sales, I believe. So,
Blimey.
big stuff for the day.
Yeah, he did all right out of that, didn't he? Yeah. Blimey.
And it's been a while since I read them. I remember I certainly read most of them. And I always thought at the time what a novel take on the vampire theme it was. One that I think has been copied since quite a bit with things like The Strain and some other things perhaps. But
Yeah. I only read the first couple, I think. I really should go back and read more of them. Well, I read them again when I was a teenager, and I was like, yeah, I like this. the goth in me appreciated that.
Well, and interesting, that's kind of the Anne Rice sort of time frame as well, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
So vampires were back in the forefront of the public consciousness, perhaps. But these weren't your Lestat gothy type vampires, were they? These ones?
No, they weren't your Byronic vampires. These are yeah. I think in terms of Vampire Masquerade, these would be your Gangrels, wouldn't they?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that really set Lumley on a path as being a professional author. As I say, he did serve 22 years in the RMP, but when he retired in December 1980, he was able to switch into becoming a full-time author, which meant he got to travel a lot. I mean, in his military career, he obviously traveled a lot, but I think he and his wife were regular at a lot of the conventions in the States and all that kind of thing. Well, he seemed quite an outgoing chap, and apparently he always answered his fan mail personally. He made an issue of answering everything that came in, at least with just a short personal message back. So it looks like he had a real connection with his fans as well.
Well, he answered me. So,
oh, really?
Yeah. I messaged him. I emailed him ages ago asking if I could use "should I met L" in a story, and he was like, "Yeah, go for it."
Oh, brilliant! I never knew that. Oh, amazing!
It was pretty much short and to the point. It was just like, "Oh, thank you for getting in touch and thanks for asking me." Yeah, go for it.
So, well, yeah, he actually said, I saw in another interview that he said he answered every email personally. So that might be just a brief thing, because you can imagine he might have 200 to answer.
Yeah.
But what he wrote, he meant that was a genuine response. You know, it wasn't just a stamp of thank you.
Nice.
We have read your letter. Thank you for your interest, kind of thing, you know. Oh, that's cool. Wow.
Yeah.
During that time, he received the British Fantasy Award in 1989. He got the Grandmaster Award at the 1988 World Horror Convention, the World Fantasy Award in 2010, I think it was. So basically, he was at least recognised in his lifetime. And he wrote 130 short stories and novellas spanning sci-fi, horror, and the mythos. So I don't think I've read any of his sci-fi work, actually.
No, I don't think I have, to be honest. I know he did another sword and sorcery series as well, didn't he? Kai of Ancient Chem or something?
Yeah, there was the Borean cycle, was that?
That's it. Yeah.
So yeah, for me, in that sense, the style kind of sits between the big three kind of thing. Obviously, drawing influence from all three of them, which is interesting.
Yeah, so back to what we were saying about the sort of Derlethian approach and the elements and things like that. I believe you've got a quote from Lumley in Dagon, haven't you? He was asked a question saying that basically he'd caught the same sort of flack about the changes he made to the mythos in the novel The Transition of Titus Crow, relating to certain mythos deities such as Nyarlathotep and Azathoth.
Yeah, and I think it's worth reading this response out in full. So this is a bit of a long paragraph, but I think this is an important aspect of Lumley's writing. Obviously, he felt quite strongly about it, and we've already mentioned his comments on Derleth, you know. So this was his reply. Transition upset a lot of people. Someone has said it's one of the worst horror novels ever. It was never intended to be a horror novel in the first place. I wanted to write a space-time adventure with a mythos background. I would think that would be obvious from even a cursory reading. It's like saying Gone with the Wind is a lousy spy story. Ah, well. But it's still in print in Germany and France. In fact, it's never been out of print in France. They just keep reprinting it. And it looks like coming out again in the USA, this time in a special edition hardback. Anyway, I've given certain reasons for the venom before, but there's another that occurs to me. People who are reading just for a good read, who don't care for stodge but like innovation, enjoy my Crow titles. Others, who have got themselves very deeply into the mythos, make occasional objection, go off me. See, it's difficult to be a mythos freak. I use that term in all fondness. I'm one myself, and not want to write mythos stories yourself. And how better to imitate the old gent of Providence and use his original concepts. But how can they when this bloody Lumley bloke has screwed it all up and called Azathoth a bomb and Shub-Niggurath the primal sex urge and Nyarlathotep the great old one's power of telepathy? But I never expected anyone to take these works as the true word. Hell, I merely use my imagination. Anyone else who wants to do it should use theirs. Do it differently. I won't complain. If someone out there wants to write about Nyarlathotep in terms all their own, or see old Shubby as a real black demonic goat, or call Azathoth the prime member of the GOO, that's up to them. They were concepts I tossed around, that's all. And I won't go deep one if someone develops his own scheme of things in a mythos framework. Why should I? But let me say this to any would-be writer who thinks he can bring the old stuff back to life without making changes. Son, you've got your work cut out for you. It ain't easy. Regrets? No, I don't think so. But about Azathoth, I put it to you, who called Azathoth a primal nuclear confusion, bubbling and blaspheming at the center of all infinity? HPL, that's who. And what was that but the Big Bang, eh? Out of chaos came order, but the great old ones want to put it back the way it was, which is the whole basis of the mythos. Now, HPL may not have meant that, but if I had noticed and used it, someone else would have, sooner or later.
Yeah, I couldn't have put it better. I could have put that better myself. Yeah, you do. I think that's something we've talked about before, haven't you? Of writers, especially modern writers, putting their own twist on things. And because I'm obviously now, like back in Lumley's time, he knew more about atomic fission and things like that than Lovecraft would have done, right? So it's putting his sort of viewpoint on it, you know. And I think people do that to this day. I know I do, and I know you do, you know. So
absolutely. And I think there's this other aspect we've spoken about before, about this idea of anything you describe in the mythos from a human's perspective is the four blind people in a room describing the elephant.
Yep.
We've got that aspect. And what we can perceive of these entities is that three-dimensional slice of a nine-dimensional being.
Yeah.
So that's why you can have all these different interpretations, even in one story, even from one character sometimes. We've all seen a Lovecraft line that says, it was like a squid, a bear, a buzzard, a cockroach.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah,
the mind is trying desperately to grasp onto something that it recognizes, and that's how our brains operate, right? We make these associations.
Yeah.
So it makes perfect sense that in one way Azathoth could be a big nuclear event somewhere. In another way, it's some blind idiot god surrounded by flute players, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did Lovecraft actually mean there are actually things playing the flute at the center of the universe, or is that just how your brain perceives it?
We're perceiving it. Yeah. Yeah. I think a great example of that is the color out of space, right? It's an entire story of people trying to describe a color that can't be described. It's, you know, which I think is absolutely brilliant.
And what are you going to do? You say, well, it's kind of a bluish green with a sort of tinge of you know,
yellow and a pink.
We don't have the language to explain.
Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that is something that Lumley suffered from in terms of criticism, and you can see that now. Sometimes quite vociferous as well.
Yeah.
And personally, from my perspective, like I say, I enjoyed his stories. I particularly enjoyed them at the time, being into the role-playing aspects. They fed very nicely into that. And I find it difficult to get upset. Now, having said that, if it comes to something like Robert E. Howard, I might be a bit more of a purist, and we could fill an hour with stuff that's wrong with all the Conan films. So, you know, I kind of understand that. But that's a very well-defined character and background and mythology, you know. I guess we can say the same with Lord of the Rings. When it comes to the mythos, I think all bets are off, really.
Yeah. Look, I mean, even like back when Lovecraft was alive, they were all doing different things with it. I mean, look at the stuff Clark Ashton Smith did with mythos elements and his own mythos elements. They were totally different to Lovecraft's, you know. And I think, like with the Derleth thing, I think people forget that Derleth was writing this stuff while Lovecraft was around, you know, like the thing that walked on the wind and things like that, you know.
And then we get onto people like Thomas Ligotti, who, I mean, there's an argument about, is he a mythos author or not? Perhaps. But to me, it's just approaching the mythos from another direction as well.
I think he certainly is in two stories at least. Sect of the Idiot, because that's Azathoth, and The Last Feast of Harlequin, because, you know, that's basically a sequel to The Festival, isn't it? Or his take on it. But yeah, I mean, again, he's got his own creation, hasn't he? The mortuary god.
Oh yeah,
I can't remember the name of it, and all that, and Basterian and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So again, different takes. I've always personally really liked Lumley's approach. I've always found his style of writing really engaging, and because I think he has a good balance of action and atmosphere.
Yes.
Because often you get one or the other, right? but I think he's got a good balance. It's like, and obviously with his army background, the action sequences have got an authenticity to them.
Yes, yeah. And that brings us in neatly to the story we're going to look at today, because of course the story features Titus Crow. So one thing that Lumley did that was a little different from other authors is have reoccurring characters in his stories. And Titus Crow is, is in the occult detective sort of slot, I guess, isn't he, really?
Oh, definitely. He's one of my favourite occult detectives. I put him right up there with Carnacki, you know. I love Titus Crow. I think they're probably my favourite Brian Lumley stories, specifically the short stories. I think they're absolutely tremendous.
And if we go back to our Dagon interview, we get another question here I'd just like to cover, because Carl asks, was Crow based upon any particular heroes of yours? And Lumley, of course, responds with what everyone is going to say when you talk about Titus Crow and his time and space traveling machine. People have likened Crow to Doctor Who, but Crow's time clock was there long before the TARDIS in a Price-Lovecraft collaboration called Through the Gates of the Silver Key. As to how Crow developed, I built him slowly, let him gather bits of mythos lore here and there, brought him on until he was ready for the burrowers. He's not really based on anyone, and certainly not on Derleth's Laban Shrewsbury, but I've always liked Van Helsing's erudition, so maybe. So everyone's going to say Doctor Who because of the clock, which we'll speak about in a minute.
Oh, I will be speaking about that in a minute.
And I have to say, I do picture Crow in a kind of Peter Cushing Doctor Who type way, perhaps.
Well, if you look at the picture on the cover of the complete Crow,
right,
he's got the cravat and the, the duster, all that kind of stuff.
But yeah, what I like about this is the way he's developed Crow as, again, if we think of real life, no one comes into the mythos knowing anything about it. You know, this guy is a sort of scholar, he's studying the occult, and he sort of falls into discovering the mythos stuff, as we see in this story, really, because he's got this clock and he hasn't got a clue what it's about or anything.
Yeah.
So it's not like a Doctor Who character who arrives in the device, you know.
Yeah.
He's got to try and figure out what it is. And I think that lends the stories, the attention and everything else as well, as we go through, we see the character develop. And of course, with the mythos, the more you know, the worse it is. You know, we see that very much across the stories.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I've got a nice little bit here in Hagopian. It's the introduction to the story, De Marigny's Clock. It's about his writing it, basically. So I just want to read this out because I think it's quite interesting. In May to June 1969, when I was a recently promoted sergeant and had been at the recruiting office for just a few months, I found the time to write De Marigny's Clock, a story that August Derleth liked at first sight. It would fit right into The Caller of the Black, his first Arkham House collection, which it did 2 years later. It's another one of those stories with quite a long printing history, but I won't go into it here. Suffice it to say that it features Titus Crow and the world's strangest timepiece, a sort of long case clock that you might even call a space timepiece. The clock wasn't my invention. It belonged to Lovecraft and E. Hoffman Price long before me. But Titus Crow and his ward, Henri Laurent de Marigny, would later borrow it to take them on some of their weirdest adventures, even to frozen Borea, and beyond that to the home of the elder gods themselves in far Elysia.
Where they discover, by the way, there's lots of other of these machines as well. The clock he's got isn't the only one. You know?
No.
These, I think they're a creation of the old gods or the elder gods. So
yeah,
a nice device for an author, because of course that gives your character scope to travel all over the place, doesn't it?
Definitely. Well, it is the same sort of mechanic as Doctor Who, really, because that was the whole point behind that. It was let's have something that could take it anywhere and any when. It's a genius bit of narrative. We've just got another short piece here. This time it's the introduction from The Complete Crow. I think it's interesting to bring this up because it's probably something we're going to mention as we go along. Way back when, before I was born, H.P. Lovecraft had written a story called The Terrible Old Man. The basic similarity between that tale and this present one didn't strike me until only very recently, but I suppose it's possible that I was subconsciously influenced sufficiently to write it after HPL. Certainly, the fate of the villain is, but that would be telling.
Yes, and you can certainly see the parallels with the terrible old man, because that's how this story opens. We've got Titus Crow in his bungalow retreat. The name of the house is Blown with an E, house. I couldn't find anything around Blown, Blowne. So I'm not sure of the derivation of that name exactly. And a bungalow retreat doesn't sound very occultish, does it? You know, I've seen people have done some drawings of Blown House, and they usually do it as this big sort of gothic, spooky mansion out on the moor somewhere. But this is a bungalow in suburban London.
Yes, it is. Yeah, with a haunted tree. There's a brief mention of that, but it's one of the other stories in here. And it's basically it's a tree that's haunted.
Right.
Billy's Oak. There we go.
We get this little picture of Crow. Well, Crow is quite an antisocial person in a sense. He keeps himself to himself. Obviously, he's an occult scholar. He's got a very interesting collection of books. And I like this. So many of them long out of print, some of them never officially in print.
Yeah, I like the fact that he's basically incredibly protective of this because London is full of collectors.
Yes. Well, it's a couple of collectors who arrived that night in the form of a pair of burglars. All right. Yeah. So we're into that terrible old man idea. And of course, what a burglar's interested in, they're not interested in arcane tomes. They're here for the cash.
Yeah. These are a proper pair of London blackers, aren't they?
Oh, yeah.
You know, they're straight out of Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels, but 2 decades before.
And I loved how one of them was described as, these guys are thick set, they're scarred and everything else. And one of them describes as a most unbeautiful thug. Unbeautiful.
Yeah. It's nice, isn't it?
The old expression used to be, a face that only a mother could love, doesn't it?
Yes. Or the northern version, a face like a welder's bench.
Yeah, and we're straight into the Cockney banter as well, and just take it easy, Gov, there'll be no bother.
Yeah, his voice soft but ugly, I thought was a nice touch.
Yeah. And what I found odd was the names, because we've got one called Joe, I think.
Yeah.
Which, all right. And the other one, I kept reading this as Patsy, because a kind of an East London name might be Patsy, or a London thing. Pat would be Patsy. But it's, now, you could read this as Pasty, right?
Which I did to begin with, yeah.
Which for English people, you think Cornish pasty, right? But it turns out it's pasty. So
yeah, after his complexion. Yeah.
Well, I wondered if the guy, because again, this being a London thing, was he a decorator, painter decorator? Is he Pete the Paste?
Yeah. That would, yeah. It's very London, isn't it? That, yeah.
Yeah, you sort of get known by your job,
You do, don't you? Yeah. Joe the Baker. Well, the Gary Newman song, Joe the Waiter.
Right.
Yeah, for the old Tube by Army track. Yeah.
Now, you might think you've been woken up in the middle of the night, faced by 2 heavies, one of who's got a gun, one of whom's wielding a kosh, that you might be a bit sort of frightened. But Crow remains remarkably calm. In fact, he gets quite angry at some point. Pasty, Crow exclaimed. Powers of observation indeed. I was just thinking before hearing your name, what a thin, pasty creature you look, Pasty. So, he's dishing it out already.
Yeah, I like this as he grins as he says that, gets out of bed and puts on his flame red dressing gown. That's an image, isn't it? Who's standing there, 2 blaggers, and he's there doing up his Noel Coward,
I have to say, when we get this description, Crow was tall and broad-shouldered, and it was plain to see that in his younger days he had been a handsome man. Even now, there was a certain tawniness about him, and his eyes were still very bright and more than intelligent. I was getting a bit of with the idea of the dressing gown and, like you say, the cravat, a sort of Jason King, Peter Wingard kind of, given this was set in 1970 as well,
Oh, yeah. Well, he's got the old facial furniture as well in the picture, hasn't he? He's got the old goatee. It's not far from a Jason King. Yeah.
And Pastey's not having this either, so he comes back with this snappy line. Lovely colour, that dressing gown. It'll match up nicely if you bleed when I rap you on the head. There's this sort of banter going backwards and forwards already between. I'm suspecting with the burglars, this is not the way normally things work out. You wake someone up with a gun on them, they're expecting a bit more cooperation than this.
Yeah. I love this next bit. Pasty laughs, slapping the cosh into his own palm. But before that, you'll tell us where it is, won't you? Surely, Crow answered immediately. It's third on the left, down the passage.
That's a carry-on line.
It is a carry-on line. Yeah. Yeah.
So basically, these guys are in to rob the place. They figure he's an old boy living on his own. He's got a load of rare stuff. He's bound to have some cash around. But Crow says, maybe it's that thing of him being like the hermit. They've always got money under the bed or in the mattress, haven't they? But he says, no, I keep my money in the bank. Oh, the other thing that reinforced this Jason King thing was this line. The man glanced appraisingly around the room, noting the silk curtains, the Bukhara rugs, the original erotic illustrations by Aubrey Beardsley in their rosewood frames. It's all very decadent, isn't it, love?
It is. Yeah, isn't it? It's brilliant.
So, yeah, they don't believe him and they start ripping the mattress apart. Basically, they go through the whole place and just start pulling things apart and smashing stuff up, trying to find money or a safe or something they can take with them.
Yeah, and Crow's temper flashes, doesn't he, when they start throwing his paintings around? Because they obviously don't know what they're worth.
Yeah, and then they get to the books, don't they? And they're just chucking this stuff about, and you can imagine how fragile a medieval manuscript might be or something. And the irony is these guys are missing the real treasure, just looking for a bit of cash.
Well, Crow mentions that, doesn't he? That these paintings are worth a fortune, but good luck finding a fence who'll touch them.
Yeah. And here's where we get our first mention of that book that we spoke about earlier, because they find what appears to be a secret panel in the wall and tap on it, and they're just going to smash it open. But Crow says, no, I'll open it. So they open up this little compartment, and there's just a shelf behind it with a single book. Pasty pushed Crow aside, lifted the book out, and read off its title. The what? Cassat Aquadingen? Huh. So, as we said, this was mentioned in Concrete Surrounds, Lumley's first story, and it's peppered throughout, particularly the Titus Crow stories, but also in many others as well. Now, each time it's mentioned, or in different stories, you learn a little bit more about it, or they're in much the same way as the Necronomicon or something else. There might be a quote from it.
Yeah.
But basically, the book appears to be a collection of spells or summonings or rituals related to aquatic creatures. We can think of, so straight away we think of the obvious. There's instructions on making an elder sign in there. And there are also 4 pages, 4, count them, of Sarthoguan rituals. So this is where I use this in my own stories, the Doggerland stories, that there's going to be 3 of those, which explores the origins of the Cathart Aquadingen, how it's first discovered and comes about, which not unnaturally is in a temple to Sarthogua. And then even up into the modern day Modunich trilogy, then it featured in that as well, as a method by which I won't say who it was, but they were getting in contact with the Deep Ones and various other creatures.
Yeah, I love this bit here about the book, because Pasty picks it up and he's like, that damn book's wet. The shaken crook exclaimed nervously. No, just sweating, Crow informed. The binding is human skin, you see. Somehow it still retains the ability to sweat, a sure sign that it's going to rain. I thought that was a lovely touch.
Yeah, it's really keeping his cool, isn't it, in this?
I think that's what I like about Crow, is that he's not this sort of dour. Despite his sort of leanings and all the rest of it, there is a lot of quips You know, he seems that he's quite a likable chap.
As a humorous guy, and yeah,
Yeah.
I think Lumley references that somewhere as well about when he was sort of formulating his character. He didn't want it to be a sort of dour, very serious.
Yeah, because like Carnacki is very serious and Holmes is very serious. And
yeah, Carnacki doesn't crack jokes, does he? Really?
No.
Or Holmes come to that. You have the occasional, don't you, with Holmes? It's played by Jeremy Brett. But
oh yeah.
So I think the burglars by this stage are already starting to feel a bit uneasy because things aren't going the way they should. You know, first of all, this guy is not playing ball with them at all. He's obviously not frightened or scared of them, and things start getting stranger and stranger. So we get into the library again, and can we say Derletian shopping list?
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Because we've got the works of Poe, first rare editions of Machen and Lovecraft, more ancient works, Josephus, Magnus, Levi, Borellus, Aeschylus and Whittingby, closely followed by a connecting set on oceanic evil, Gaston Lefay's Dwellers in the Depths, Oswald's Legends of Liqualia, which is a great name, Gantley's Hydrophine, the German Unterseekolten, and Hartrack's In Pressured Places. What a great collection of book titles for underwater nasties.
Yeah, it's funny because that is the first thing that I thought reading that again. Oh, look, it's a Derletian shopping list.
To be fair, though, he's used mostly his own stuff there, isn't he, really? But again, it's that idea of mixing the real books in with the fictional ones.
Yeah, which is something Lovecraft did. So
yeah.
Because you had like the Book of Dizan next to an Necronomicon and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, witch cults in Western Europe next to,
Yeah, Mrs. Murray, yeah.
So they pull all these books down, they're chucking everything around, still no sign of any money, and then they see the clock. So let's talk about the clock, shall we?
Indeed. Yeah, clock of grandfather class. It's shaped like a sarcophagus, and it's covered in runes and occult doodlings, basically. And the first thing... when I read it, like first thing when I first read this story, I was like, "Oh no, it's the Master." Because in the Tom Baker era of Doctor Who, the Master's TARDIS was a grandfather clock.
Which I suppose, if you're thinking of a time machine that's inconspicuous, I mean, the TARDIS being see, I always think a police box isn't that inconspicuous, is it? I mean, maybe it was back in 1950s, early 60s, I guess. But even so, it's something that people would go into.
Yeah. No, but the whole thing with the TARDIS is they have a chameleon circuit.
Yeah.
So they adapt to their surroundings and blend in.
Right.
But the Doctor's is broke. And it stuck when he was in a scrapyard in 60s London.
Right.
And he never bothered fixing it.
Yeah.
That's the whole... that's basically the backstory for that.
So this clock, it not only looks strange, it has four hands for a start, but it gives off a certain vibe or atmosphere. I think we've learned already that Crowe has spent some time trying to work out how this thing operates with no success, and he's an experienced occultist, but this is out of his depth, right? He's
got a desk set up next to the clock, hasn't he, with a lamp on it and a bunch of occult tomes. Because you said, I think he mentioned earlier that he spent the previous day once again trying to figure it out and not getting anywhere.
But there's something, and perhaps Joe is oblivious to this, but Pasty seems a little more sensitive because he doesn't really want to go near it. And Joe is convinced that, well, the money is probably hidden inside the clock. Just wants to take a hammer to it and smash it open. And Pasty is, you do it, I'm not touching it. There's something wrong here.
Yeah, I really like that. It's just like, not on your Nelly, governor, sort of thing, isn't it?
So, yeah, Joe takes his gun and raps on the panel below the dial of the clock. The sound was sharp and solid. Joe turned and grinned at Titus Crowe. There certainly seemed to be something in there. His grin rapidly faded when he saw Crowe grinning back. That's great. And it was like, go on then, open it, go on then.
Yeah, I've been trying for weeks and can't do it. And you got that lovely bit of Pasty saying, so where'd you plug it in?
Yeah. And
obviously the hands are moving, yeah. If it doesn't plug in, how do you wind it up?
But then the reply is should it be plugged in?
Yeah.
But Joe apparently is a bit of what they used to call a Peter man, is a safe cracker, right? So although this isn't a safe, there's some sort of mechanism that he manages to work out. Now I was just going to mention as well. So de Marigny, you mentioned Henri earlier, because this is de Marigny's clock, which, as we know, goes back to Through the Gates of the Silver Key, which Lovecraft wrote with Price. So the de Marigny is Etienne Laurent de Marigny, who was described as a distinguished Creole student of mysteries and Eastern antiquities and North America's greatest mystic in that story, which of course he appeared in alongside Randolph Carter. And he also pops up again later in Out of the Eons, which Lovecraft wrote with Hazel Hild, which I think was a mummy story.
Yeah, in a museum.
I think it was a mummy in a museum, wasn't it? Yeah. And so Lumley obviously took that character and then developed it, because it's the son, Henri, who later teams up with Titus Crow.
Yeah, there's a couple of Lovecraft's creations in this, apart from the clock. There's also a mention of Ward Phillips. Yeah, there's a mention of Ward Phillips, who appeared in Through the Gates of the Silver Key, described as an elderly eccentric of Providence, Rhode Island. This Providence mystic, who enjoyed a long and close correspondence with Randolph Carter, is said to be lean, grey, long-nosed, clean-shaven, and stoop-shouldered. Now, Ward Phillips also appeared in August Derleth's The Lamp of Alhazred, and he was basically used as a cipher for Lovecraft. Closest of all to Howard Phillips Lovecraft, a pulp fiction writer who makes extra money revising other people's stories, who goes on imaginary journeys to Arkham, Innsmouth, Relay, the Plateau of Leng, who writes Cthulhu, Hastur, Yog-Sothoth, etc., who lives on Angel Street in Providence. Ward Phillips is 46 when he disappears, which is the same age Lovecraft was when he died. And in this story, it mentions that Ward Phillips went missing.
Right.
The clock.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly, I discovered while researching this that there's another story called De Marigny's Clock, written by somebody called Ran Cartwright, which, it was released in a fanzine in the early 90s, 91, I believe. And that tells the story of Ward Phillips going missing.
Oh, interesting. Oh, we'll have to see if we can dig that one out.
I've never read it. I'd never heard of it until today.
No, I hadn't. No. That's one thing, just going through all these old Dagons, again, because they have fiction in there from people like Peter Jeffries and others. So it's, what was the American fanzine? Crypt of Cthulhu?
Crypt of Cthulhu. That was the Robert M. Price one, wasn't it?
Yeah, I've got a few issues of that. Again, at some point, perhaps we'll do an episode on looking back at some of these old fanzines.
That's a great idea. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, Joe, being the expert safe cracker, manages to get into the clock. The four hands on the carven dial stood still for an instant of time before commencing fresh movements in alien and completely inexplicable sequences. Joe seems quite pleased with himself, but Pasty sensed the outsideness at the same time as Crow. He leapt across the room shouting, Joe, for God's sake, leave it alone, leave it alone. Crow, on the other hand, spurred by no such sense of comradeship, quietly stood up and backed away.
Yeah, which is the sensible thing to do. Yeah, because you start getting this dim, eerie, dappled light coming out of the open panel. Now, that's a great sort of image.
This put me in mind of From Beyond with the resonator, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And the ticking seems to increase in volume and starts going wild and a crazy rhythm. The hands are sweeping about the dial, confused and orderless. Joe's braced himself against the frame, and it's as though something is trying to draw him in to the clock.
It's that classic, that classic thing of putting your hand into a hole and something grabbing it, isn't it? Yeah. So what does he do? He does what any hardened blacker would do. He sticks his gun through the hole and looses off each chamber.
6 shots in rapid succession, the whole lot going, which of course does absolutely nothing. By this time, Pasty has got an arm around Joe's waist. So there's like this sort of tug of war going on there between Pasty on the one hand and whatever is pulling Joe in on the other. And Joe's really trying here. Great veins stuck out from his neck and his eyes seemed likely at any moment to pop from his head. He gave one bubbling scream as his head and neck jerked suddenly forward into the maw of the mechanical horror, and then his body went limp. So Pasty sort of pulls him out, and we get this horrible effect.
This is grim.
So yeah, we got this horrible piece here now where they pull Joe out, or where Pasty pulls Joe out, and the cloth of his jacket near the left shoulder and that same area of the shirt immediately beneath had been removed, seemingly dissolved or burnt away by some unknown agent, and in place of the flesh, which should by all rights have been laid bare by this mysterious vanishment, there had been a great blistered, bubbling blotch of crimson and brown, and the neck and head had been in the same sickening state. Blistered, bubbling blotch. That's nice.
It's lovely, isn't it? Yeah.
Put me in mind of burnt pizza.
Yeah. Freddy Krueger. Yeah.
And then Joe just disappears, right? It's just pulled thump into the clock and it's gone.
Because he's still got hold of Joe's legs, hasn't he? And whatever's got Joe just goes, you're coming in here and all, mate. And because he's a lot slighter, isn't he, Pasty? He's sort of, you get the impression he's this sort of thin, weaselly kind of figure. So he just goes straight through.
Yeah, it's almost like an implication, like he dives headlong. It's almost like he throws himself in. So, you wonder what influence is at play there, not just a physical influence, perhaps some sort of psychic influence as well.
Well, you get that in the next bit, because Crow, as we found out in various of the Crow stories, is sensitive to psychic stuff. He had psychic impressions of Pasty earlier, didn't he? There was indicating that Pasty was quite sensitive to these things as well. So yeah, whatever force, it starts to affect Crow, and he basically blacks out, doesn't he?
Yeah. So he awakes sometimes later and he thinks, well, was this just some sort of weird nightmare I've had? But of course, no. He's got books all over the place. Looks like a bomb's hit it. As the saying used to be.
Pretty much.
So what does he do? He makes himself a large jug of coffee and pours himself a huge brandy and sits there sipping at both until there's none of either left.
And when both the jug and glass were empty, he started all over again. Sounds like my kind of chap.
That's a way to regain your sand points,
isn't it? No.
Now, I thought this was a really nice ending because it's quite subtle. I think I probably missed this the very first time I read it, but going back and reading it again. So through this, he figures out that the clock is some sort of transportation device. It's used to travel from place to place or take you from place to place. He doesn't know exactly how or why, but at least now he's got a line of inquiry he can follow. I feel like it's broken that first part of the code now.
Yeah.
And in fact, he even gets this impression, this sense, that somewhere out in the worlds of Aldebaran, at a junction of forces neither spatial, temporal, nor of any intermediate dimension recognized by man except in the wildest theories, the Lake of Harley sent up a few streamers of froth and fell quickly back into silence. So we get a lovely little nod to the King in Yellow mythology is there.
Nice.
And the idea that maybe what burnt the guy was the waters of the Lake of Harley.
Indeed.
And they've both just kind of gone plop, and that's it. Now the lake is still again.
Yeah, I really liked that, the ending. And also the mention as well, because you got the rushing and tearing of great beasts designed in a fashion beyond man's wildest conjecturing. That'll be the Shantax, right? That are supposed to circle Carcosa and all that,
Yeah, so it's very nice how we go from this suburban bungalow in London through something. Well, I suppose it's not just an innocuous grandfather clock. It looks strange anyway. But then you're in this place that is sort of out of space and time, to quote someone else.
Yeah, indeed.
And again, anything that draws the King in Yellow in, I'm always a sucker for, I think. So.
Same, yeah. So the implication is that wherever they ended up in Carcosa, basically, the Lake of Harley outside the walls of the city of Carcosa. There we go.
So yeah, excellent story, and it's certainly, it's sad that it takes an event like this to make you think, oh, I really should go back and read some more of that author. And I think it's, I don't know, maybe as you get on a bit, and certain things happen in your life, you start thinking, no, you should make the time. The people that you enjoy their work, you should make the effort to at least just let them know, or, appreciate their work a bit more, perhaps, because that the Marigny's clock is ticking for all of us,
Indeed. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So that's basically the end of today's story, and the end of a very hurried but heartfelt tribute to Mr. Brian Lumley, a favourite of both of ours, I think it's very safe to say.
Yes, absolutely. As I say, a very prolific author, and one that, again, I'll come back to that point that I made at the start. I was just surprised by how much Brian Lumley I'd actually read.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. For those of you out there, so there probably will be some that haven't read much of his work, and you're interested in the Cthulhu Mythos stuff, those 2 volumes that I mentioned at the start, the Solaris volumes, The Taint and Hagopian, are a really good place to start.
Excellent. So thanks very much for joining us today, folks. And we just want to finish by reading a poem by Brian Lumley. This is actually in that issue of Dagon from 1986. If you can get back copies of Dagon, they sometimes come up on eBay. I think there might be some PDF versions going around as well. Then I do highly recommend it. As I say, it's a fan-produced fanzine, so production-wise it's very basic, but absolutely packed full of interesting content, including this poem which I'll read now. Whistler by Brian Lumley. A lonely road, all misted gloom, distorted by the shapes of night, and shadowed trees that leer and loom to fill the heart with fright. A mile to go, and then one more, before I knock with trembly fist upon the hidden, unmarked door, and greet the one I've missed. To keep my darkling fears at bay, I whistle as I pass along, a tuneless tune along the way that seems so long. And then, befriended by the moon, which cleaves the clouds to light my path, I whistle a less breathless tune and tread the silver swath. The dark once more, and sore afraid, I whistle louder, while the road seems even longer through the glade, and heavier my load. But then I snort at my fears, and fondly pat my weighty swag. To think a ghoul of all my years should fear what's in his bag.